Okay, good morning and welcome to the webinar. I appreciate you joining us. My name is Troy Baker. I'm the director of the Better Business Bureau Educational Foundation. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. Everybody is on mute. The presentation is being recorded. We'll take questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, please type them into the questions section and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. We're happy to answer any questions you have. We'll send out an email following the webinar. It'll have a recording, it'll have some slides, it'll have some information to help you go through this process that everybody's working through. And if you are having problems hearing anything or seeing anything, you can leave the webinar and come back in. Sometimes that helps get a better connection. So with that, I will hand things over to Phil Catlett, President and CEO of the Better Business Bureau serving Western Michigan. Phil, you're still on mute.
Welcome everyone to the BBB Connects webinar series. Every organization needs a plan to reopen wisely, safely, in a way that honors and protects our employees and customers. What should be in that plan? How do you make it work for your business in particular? Mark Tomasik, or Tomasik, I think is the right pronunciation, Associate General Counsel for DP Fox, and Marshall Lohr, IT Director for the Better Business Bureau serving Western Michigan, share their experience in creating reopening plans. They will also answer your questions about what West Michigan businesses need to know to safely welcome back employees and customers. Of course, this should also be done in a way that strengthens your organization, setting it up to succeed in the future. Of course, in the context of doing better business, we must all do these things in a way that builds trust. As our BBB Back to Work plan was developed, Marshall Lohr reviewed many resources and continually collaborated with staff to make sure we thoughtfully and wisely built this plan. And when we shared that plan with our BBB Board of Directors, we found that Mark had a wealth of information as an attorney and a person who was significantly involved in the DP Fox family of businesses in their Back to Work plans. And with that, we welcome you to this webinar and hope it is very useful. And Marshall, you're on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marshall, the Director of IT here at the BBB. Boy, I'm really rocking that COVID hair in that picture, aren't I? I was asked to present today about my experience developing the BBB's Return to Work plan and policy. So I'm going to walk you through the process that I followed, and hopefully that will offer you some insight about what you can do at your business. I took a risk-based approach to the problem because a risk-based approach allows you to focus your attention on your particular business and situation. The first step is to build a team. Most of the time, it's extremely helpful to work with a team of people from different departments and levels of your business. That way you'll gain valuable insight about what others within your organization see as priorities, what they see as threats, and what controls may already be in place that can mitigate the effects of those threats. The more complete and diverse you make your team, the better your assessment is going to be in the end. If you're a one-person show, then you still need to seek opinions from peers and experts. Someone should head up the team as well. You need someone to be the leader, and that leader needs to educate themselves about the behavior of the virus and regulations surrounding the return to work in your normal operations, at least as normal as they can be right now. The next step is assessing your risks. You accomplish this by identifying threats, vulnerabilities, and the likelihood and potential impact of any event. You also want to look into compliance and regulatory issues. Threats are things like employees, customers, or vendors entering into your building or packages being delivered, those kinds of things. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses within your business that allow you to face those threats or not allow you to face those threats. You want to ask yourself some questions. Are you a business that requires many people in your facility? In other words, a large number of people in an enclosed space at one time? Are you a business that requires your employees to travel or travel internationally? Are you one that requires employees to touch clients or customers? Does anybody have to handle or transfer goods between employees, clients, or customers? Do you have a lot of high-touch areas in your operation? These types of questions are going to allow you to think about what threats and vulnerabilities you may have within your organization. And the last thing you have to consider, as I mentioned earlier, are compliance issues. You want to look at local, state, and federal laws and regulations. Some of those may be specific to your industry as well. Once you've identified all of the issues, you may be able to stop there. It depends on the complexity of your operation and the number of threats that you face. However, if you're sitting back at that point saying, where do I start? You may wish to prioritize the issues by determining the likelihood and impact of them. That's where a risk matrix comes in and can be very helpful. Once you've graded the likelihood and impact of the threats that you have put on the table, then they can be placed in a matrix like this to determine which are priorities. It doesn't need to be a complicated process. Like this matrix, a simple high, medium, and low evaluation can be given to the threats, and you may want to do your research on the likelihoods. Again, educate yourself about the virus and recommendations of experts. The reason I say that is it's helpful if you can be as quantitative as possible with the likelihoods, if you can. A lot of times it's not possible. I'll share some references later on that may be helpful in educating yourself about those things. So now that you've identified the issues and established some priorities, we can develop our response and our return to work plan. You can respond to risk in 4 different ways. There are other models, but this is the model that I used here at the BBB. You can either avoid, transfer, accept, or mitigate risk. As an example, you can avoid the risk of employees entering and working in your facility by having them work remotely. In fact, that's the current recommendation. If employees can work remotely, they should be working remotely. You can transfer some of the risk by having health and liability insurance, or you can choose to accept the risk. But you should really analyze those risks before you accept them. Be sure that you've got a very sound reasoning for accepting any risk. And lastly, you can mitigate a risk, which is what we'll concentrate more on today. In fact, writing a return to work policy and procedure is in and of itself a way to mitigate potential risk. In response to COVID-19, there are 3 areas of mitigation that I found were consistent. They are engineering or environmental, administrative, and personal protection equipment or PPE. According to the experts, these are listed in the order of their effectiveness. Changes to the environment are the most effective in making sure that you are addressing your risk. Engineering and environmental modifications involve changing the workspace itself. You need to adjust the workstation placement or install barriers sometimes. You need to make changes to the HVAC system sometimes and increase outside air exchange or improve filtration. You may need to reduce frequently touched items by providing no-touch waste disposal or disposable plates and silverware. Those are a couple of things that we did here at the Bureau. You may need to close off certain common areas as well, or schedule times for those to be used. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but you kind of get the idea of where those changes could be. And then administrative mitigation involves changing how things are done. Some examples you may wish to include in a policy are social distancing. You can find some good examples of what that means at the CDC's website. Employee temperature and health screenings can be done before people enter the building. Staggered shifts and lunches can be used. Employee training for things like hand washing and proper cleaning, procedures for confirmed illness or illness on the premises, procedures for deliveries, vendors, travels, meetings, and procedures for reporting violations to the policy. You may not want employees policing the policy for themselves. The policy can also inform employees about available services like mental health services. And lastly, you should document everything. I suggest you document all the changes and develop a policy that employees must sign before returning to work. The last slide here are some resources that I put together that may be helpful to you. The first two are the Michigan Safe Start Plan that gives you the phases of Governor Whitmer's plan for restarting, and also the governor's executive orders. I found it very helpful to go in and actually read the orders themselves rather than listen to someone's interpretation of them. The CDC's website was invaluable as far as coming up with health questions to ask for screening. EEOC answered a lot of questions about what was legal to ask employees to do. And this just came out a couple days ago. The Michigan Symptoms app is something the state is offering for employers that will, it's on a smartphone, and it will allow your employees to answer the health questions and track that for you. And then Erin Bromage has a blog, and she's a professor and immunologist at the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth. And she wrote a blog post that is really helpful that Phil provided to all of us in understanding how viruses spread and things that you may need to do within your workspace. And I'll be available for questions later.
Thank you, Marshall. And I do want to share the Better Business Bureau has put together an app which includes an example plan. So this is based off of the plan that Marshall put together for the Better Business Bureau. Marshall put together an example that you can look at and modify for your specific circumstances. That is on our app. You've seen the link here. There's a QR code as well. This will be shared out after the webinar as well. You can also find a searchable list of companies that are offering PPE. So as you look for masks and hand sanitizer and the other things you're going to need, there's a way to get that from our app here. And if you are a company that's providing these services, you can enter your information so companies can come and see what you have available as well. You can also stay up to date on webinars and other resources the Better Business Bureau has as well. We're now going to hand it over to Mark, and he's going to talk more about Fox and what they have done.
Good morning, everyone. Mark Tomasik here. I am Associate General Counsel and Director of Risk Management for DP Fox and its family of companies. And the first thing that jumps out at me when I look at that picture, that was taken on my first day of the job when I was 33 years old, and now I'm in my 40s. So that was definitely false advertising on the picture there. But I want to share briefly DP Fox and a little bit about our portfolios. We have Fox Motors. That's kind of the entity that a lot of people know, which is dealerships that run from Marquette, Michigan, all the way down kind of along the west side of Michigan, hits over into Ann Arbor a little bit, into Grand Rapids, over into Chicago. Then we also have involvement with the Grand Rapids Griffins and holdings in the Bahamas. And I mention all that not to, brag about our size, but the reason I bring that up is because what I want to focus on today is dealing with COVID-19 and the reopening that many of you are going through if you are a multi-location business. and the challenges that brings. So you can only imagine what we're dealing with in Negaunee, Michigan, at the top of the UP versus what we're dealing with in the Bahamas or somewhere else is very different in so many regards. So if you flip to the next slide there, Troy. To be a company like that, you have more, it's more of everything. You have more employees, and that brings with it, the gamut of personal situations that people might have. Different communities are dealing with this virus differently. There's different virus activity in different locations. There's different personal beliefs and preferences as it relates to the viruses. Different degrees of concern. The facilities are different. Some facilities are perfectly set up to, as Marshall said, to mitigate exposure to the virus. Other facilities could not be worse. And when we're talking about an arena downtown Grand Rapids, it's very challenging to effectively mitigate exposure in that environment. There's much more regulations and more varying regulations when you're spread out. I mentioned this earlier to both these points, but there's a variance in virus activity. Downtown Chicago has different virus activity than Marquette, Michigan, as is different than Ann Arbor, Michigan, as is different than the Bahamas. And I mentioned this one also, there's various disparity in levels of concern, and there's disagreement about the appropriate measures that a company, a government, or a company should take. So more means more challenges, and you're dealing with just a wide variety of things to think about. So the first thing to think about if you're a multi-location business is you really need to be aware, as Director of Risk Management, I'm protecting the employees from harm, but I'm also protecting the company from harm. So you have to be aware of what obligations, what are your legal obligations, okay? That's kind of your starting point when you're thinking about a response. And you need to be aware, a lot of folks aren't aware of exactly how many authorities there are that they need to be cognizant of, okay? Everyone is aware of the governor. The governors have kind of taken the leading role in responding to the pandemic. And if you're in Michigan, it's been Governor Whitmer who's on the TV every time you turn around, announcing some new action. And really the way she governs in this pandemic is by way of executive order. And that's the primary source of authority. And so she comes on typically, every Thursday at 3 o'clock, and she lays out what the new actions are going to be. And Marshall hit on this, and I can't emphasize how important it is. Don't just listen to her 30-minute presentation. Go online. All you have to do is Google Michigan executive orders, and it'll bring up the list of every executive order that's been signed. You can go historically, but really all you want to do is look at this year, 2020, and print and read the executive order that she just got done talking about, because it's impossible in a 20-minute presentation to probably hit on everything that's in the executive order. And even if she does, it's probably unlikely that you caught every piece of it. So you're going to want to print it out and read it for yourself. Get the highlighter out, highlight the parts that are important to you and relevant to your business. And I would recommend getting the old-fashioned 3-ring binder. That's what I do. And I have all of these executive orders as they come out printed and in a 3-ring binder, because sometimes she references back. There'll be one executive order that'll have some new laws, but that'll say then this does not supersede, or the rules promulgated in the executive order from 2 weeks ago still apply. And then you got to flip back and find out what they're talking about there. So also, as it relates to the executive orders, it's just a mindset as a business owner and operators that you have to be nimble and flexible, because there's not a lot of lead time. Hopefully, as we're opening up more and more, we're going to see less and less drastic change because things are just getting more and more open. But for a while there, you would hear on a Thursday that there's been some major change to your business or some obligations that need to be implemented, and it needs to be implemented in 24 hours, or it comes out on Thursday afternoon, and by Monday morning you have to have this whole policy ready to go, and that's really challenging. So the way you make sure that you're hitting on all the requirements is by printing out and reading the order. Also, if you're a business with multiple locations, you have to be cognizant of county health departments. So, for example, Washtenaw County, which is Ann Arbor, some of these places, there's no state requirement. For a while, as this was going on, there were no statewide requirements that we temperature test and those sort of things. But local health departments did implement that. So, Washtenaw County and the health department of Northwest Michigan, they had implemented those well in advance. So while we were not temperature testing in Grand Rapids, we were temperature testing in Washtenaw County, for example. So as a business owner, you have to be aware that there's more that you are obligated to follow than just these executive orders. Of course, getting down to a even more local level is your local municipality. And how are these local municipalities dealing with it? And how will it affect your business? More likely than a regulation that they're putting on you as a business owner, really what's happening is you have to understand how their response to the pandemic and the orders will affect your business. So, for example, Meridian Township, which is a township out in the middle of Michigan, Lansing area, where we have some businesses, they shut down. So they ceased all meetings. There were no permits being issued. And you have to be aware of how that's going to affect your business. It may slow things down if you have projects going out there. If you're a contractor, you need to pull permits or various things like that. So it's wise to be aware of how these impact your local municipalities. And the last item that's not on the slide, and Marshall hit on it a little bit also, is really be aware of OSHA and MyOSHA, the Office of the Michigan Office of Occupational Health and Safety. They are very involved in COVID, and they have put out pretty extensive written materials on what businesses should do in the face of this pandemic. So be aware of OSHA. Okay, so as you're reopening, really I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have a written preparedness plan. And they're really at this point now required of all businesses who are going to have employees on site. And, having a written plan is just critical, especially the more spread out you are, because the more spread out you are, the harder it is, to have the eyeball-to-eyeball conversation, so to speak, and get the word out to all of your employees about what the expectations are. But having that plan that you can cite to, that you can distribute, is just critical to a smooth reopening. And what we found as we launched our plan is that there's going to be some things that are universal, that apply to every employee in every location, in every job duty. And for example, some of those things are your sanitation expectations for hygiene, for example. You want to be educating. It's not just enough to tell your employees, hey, you need to wash your hands. You should really let them know proper hand washing techniques, warm water, sing happy birthday twice, all those things while you're washing your hands. Coughing, proper methods for coughing, of course, the 6 feet of recommended separation. So those are things that you're going to want to share with everyone universally in your policy. Also, of course, the availability of personal protective equipment needs to be the same with everyone. If you have someone working on site, it is the company's obligation to provide them, at this point, minimally with a face mask. But I would encourage you to provide other things as well. Gloves, if appropriate, depending on the job. I know in the car dealership world, we've provided some eye protection, not for your standard sanding and all those sort of things where you might need it, but just face protection for potential virus spread. And then communication. Communication has to be, of course, universal across your business. And really, there's two groups that you're going to be communicating with. Those are your employees and your customers. And we're going to talk about them more below, but you need to lay out the expectations. And what I mean by universal is you have to let customers and employees know what the expectations are. Now, the expectations may be different, which we're going to get into in the next bullet point, but the notion that you have to communicate these very thoroughly is universal in your plan, and you have to plan how you're going to do that communication. And then finally, training. Every employee, you can never take for granted that employee or someone that works with you is going to have the same knowledge base that you do on any of these things that we've just discussed. So you have to come up with a training plan how to effectively communicate these issues. And Marshall hit on this as well. You know, you should educate yourself on virus activity, the legal aspects, all those sort of things, and then communicate those down through your training, because people are really interested in this topic. So as the leader of a company or the manager of a company, that's your opportunity to really establish, you know, that trust with your employees and lay that out for them. And the next bullet point, which says 2 there, I see it should say 3, but is your plan is going to vary depending on site-specific things. So, for example, one that jumps out is the expectations of employees. Now, you know, if you're working again in a crowded building in Chicago, there's going to be obviously different expectations than someone who's working in the UP, and the same applies for customers. So one thing that's been, you know, pretty newsworthy and that's been fairly controversial, to be honest, is the face masks. And in Michigan, executive order requires that all of us wear face masks anytime that we are in an enclosed public facility where 6 feet of separation cannot be consistently maintained. So as the business owner, you're going to have to figure out what is your policy towards your customers. Are you going to want to, businesses are not obligated to enforce that on their customer base. So you're going to have to talk to your leaders and talk to the other people you work with and determine what is your company's approach going to be. Are you going to require your customers to wear face masks? And I think when you consider that, you need to also consider your employees. If you have customers coming in and out, what do you owe your employees to the extent face masks help prevent the spread of the virus? You know, what do you owe to your employees to try and keep them safe? At the same time, you have to be sensitive to, you know, kind of the collective community that you're operating in and what their expectations and what their feelings are on face masks, and also ultimately you have to make a decision. So I raise that just as an example of how your policy may deviate in various locations. The other thing, of course, staffing, hours, customer service strategies, all those things are going to vary. And we're going to talk about on the next page how you implement those things in a policy. So anytime you roll out a policy of this kind of substance, this is a very substantial problem that we have here. It's not easy. And really, when you roll it out, you want to kind of begin with the end in mind. And the end is to have a policy that the vast majority of your employees and customers feel good about, that they will follow, and that ultimately will be effective. And the way you need to do that, I mean, you can roll out a policy, but if no one follows it, it's worth nothing. It's not even worth the paper it's written on. So you need to obtain buy-in. And the best way to obtain buy-in is to do it on the front end. And if you have a larger company with multi-locations, you're going to want to develop a diverse team where input can be heard and considered from kind of across the spectrum. Now, feedback and building that team, it's always a dicey thing, because on one hand, you want to get all this feedback. On the other hand, decisions need to be made, and you need to move forward. So you can't get so bogged down where you're not making progress. But at the same time, it's important to take and consider and give people in different sectors of your company the opportunity to provide their feedback as it relates to the implementation of policies that are going to affect them and affect their coworkers. Okay. Really, when you're obtaining buy-in, it's important to explain the why behind the what. So what is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing this, this policy. The why is why we need to do it. And it helps to just break it down. I mean, as a lawyer, it comes naturally, but you may want to consider it also in your business to print out these executive orders and just explain to your team members, this is why we're doing it. Educate them on the virus, educate them on the law, and move forward and try and get their buy-in that way. And it's also important then for them to relay to you the temperature of their teams and the employees that they have at their site, so you can kind of take that into consideration moving forward. Now, the pre-rollout is what I call, basically you've gotten that initial buy-in from your key people. You've gotten a good draft of your policy. You're probably like 90% there. You're in kind of the last 10%. And what you want to do is you definitely want to send out a final draft or a just before final draft to your team that you've developed, to give them that opportunity to provide feedback on that final version that you're considering. And then what also you want to do if you're a multi-location business is that's your time where you probably want to designate captains. And that may be different from the person who was on that initial buy-in team. Maybe that was your general manager or something like that who is extremely busy running your day-to-day business. And it may be the opportunity to identify another person. Maybe that person has an inclination to this sort of thing, risk management or something. But identify people in different teams or different locations who can kind of be the eyes and the ears of the company as it relates to this initiative. Then you come to your rollout of the policy, and there's a phrase that I heard early in my career that always stuck with me. It says you have to go a mile to get an inch, and by that, to get this policy implemented, even a little bit, you're gonna have to go to the extreme, and just emailing it out and saying, hey, here's our policy, please follow it. That's just not going to work, obviously. So it needs to be rolled out kind of with some fanfare, especially if you're a larger. All these things apply, of course, if you're a larger company. The smaller you are, maybe you don't have to go through all these steps. Maybe you still do, but maybe not. With a large company, you're going to want to email it out. You're going to want to get probably your video, your implementation video, where you have somebody doing a quick 2-minute speech where they explain what's going on, why it's going on, the importance of it, and that should be probably for more of the higher level, more visible employees in your company that does that rollout video. And then even I would encourage a site-to-site visit very shortly after the rollout, maybe even the same day, definitely the same week if possible, to go out and talk to people about it and answer any questions and have some of those face-to-face meetings. We're 6 feet apart, right? And then finally, your last step of policy implementation is going to be auditing it. And you're going to have to make sure that the policy initiative that you set forth is being followed. For a company, it may even be worse from a liability standpoint, arguably, if you have a policy and then there's blatant disregard for the policy and the company is not taking any reasonable steps to enforce the policy, that's not a good situation. So depending on whether this is possible or not, your locations and things of that nature, you're going to want to get out and drop in and do audits to make sure that the policies are being followed. In the event that's not possible, these team site captains that I discussed earlier, you're probably going to want to arrange weekly calls with them and have them being your eyes and ears to make sure that what's being done is actually being done. So the final point I want to make that, again, is not on this slide, but what has really struck me during this pandemic more than anything is how important being nimble and fluid is. And it relates to the policy too. It's unbelievable, especially early on in this whole thing, how rapidly things were changing. And, you can spend, hours and hours, blood, sweat, and tears putting together this detailed manual or policy or preparedness plan. And things may change and you have to be ready to abandon it and change drastically. And same with your business practices. One thing we've all learned is we have to be able to change our business practices on a dime. And so it's really a mindset thing, but I would encourage everyone on this call is as things are opening back up again, and we're getting back to normal or something that resembles normal, I would encourage you to maybe even start writing down some of the business practices that you have learned and that you successfully implemented during the times where the shutdown had occurred, because there is no saying that we may not have to go back to that. Of course, we all hope we don't. Every day we hope we don't, but it is possible. And, let's take this time and try and extract the lessons that we have learned during this time, so that if, God forbid, we are faced in a situation in October, November, January, next March, where we have to tighten back up and maybe go through some of this again, that we are better prepared, that we are stronger than we were this time around, and that we can kind of hopefully seamlessly transition into some of these alternative business practices. And we can, we know what to do with the PPE to keep our employees safe. We know how to communicate with our customers to let them know what new sales processes we've implemented, and that we're in a strong position to tackle this again head on if God forbid it, we have to. So that's it. Those are my comments on preparedness in the pandemic.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. I will remind people, if you have questions, please enter them into the questions section. We will try to get to your questions as you have them. We do have some that were submitted. The first one, and I'll give this one to Mark here, is you talked about the temperature screenings. Can we require a staff member to conduct these temperature screenings? And then it asks about, can we require them to do that? But how do you go about, what's the best way to go about selecting who will be doing these temperature screenings, and what advice do you have for businesses as they go through that process?
Sure. Okay. So, the temperature screening, this is obviously, I'm guessing that probably none of your employees thought they were signing up to be engaged in, nursing type activities when they hired on. So, I think the first thing is just to keep in mind how it may potentially be an uncomfortable thing for an employee to do who was, maybe they were doing your office manager or something like this, and now they're temperature testing employees. I mean, it's quite a deviation. So I would encourage everyone to be sensitive to that. Now, the legal question as to whether or not you can force an employee to do it is majority of employees these days are at-will employees, and they can be separated from employment for pretty much any non-discriminatory reason. And a discriminatory reason would fall into the categories of race, gender, religion, national origin, those sort of things. So from a purely legal perspective, you can terminate someone or separate their employment for any reason that you want, as long as it's not discriminatory. And I would argue that, letting someone go for not temperature testing or not wanting to be engaged in the temperature testing process would not be a discriminatory reason, so they could probably be separated. But having said that, I would not encourage you to do that. If you have a good employee and they just don't feel comfortable with it, I would work with them on that, and I would not encourage you to separate for that reason. Now, when you do find an employee who's willing to do it, a couple of things. Obviously, you're going to want to get a touchless thermometer. You don't want employees, taking temperatures the old-fashioned way, as I like to say. But you want to be touchless. You want to make sure they have gloves, definitely mask. Potentially one of those things that's a face shield, that drops down over your face. Because even the touchless, you're going to have to get. I've had my temperature taken several times with that. I mean, the person has to get fairly close to the person that they're taking the temperature of. So it's also happens to be allergy season, and there could be an accidental sneeze or something like that during the process. So you're going to want to protect that person, because if there's any claim that they get sick or they're not properly protected while they're taking the temperature, you of course could have a variety of claims, a workers' compensation claim. You could have a violation of a MIOSHA claim. So you want to make sure that person's adequately protected. And then keep in mind, the person should probably be, in an ideal world, part of your HR department, because they are collecting medical data, temperatures and that sort of thing. So that needs to be pretty tightly controlled. I mean, I don't know, most people probably wouldn't care if other people knew what their temperature was, but that's really beside the point. The fact is, it is medical data, your temperature every single day, and that should be kept pretty tight within your company. So I would encourage someone in the HR department who's already familiar with some of the obligations as it relates to HIPAA and protecting medical data.
Thank you. I've got somebody who says they're an interior designer and they go to clients' home. Is there any specific practice they should be aware of besides masks and social distancing? Mark, I assume you looked at similar things as Fox Motors expanded the delivery options for vehicles, right?
Yeah. So let me think. So an interior decorator. I mean, if you're going into someone's home, I'm not sure. I mean, obviously you want to keep the mask on. You want to keep your distance. You want to spend as little time in their home as possible. So one of the things we've tried to encourage our customers to do is to, take advantage of online. And I'm just mentioning this because maybe there's a way to implement this into that profession. Instead of coming in and spending an hour in our showroom looking at cars, take advantage of our online showroom, which the pictures these days are just, fantastic. You get a really good sense for the car by looking at these high definition pictures, and identify which car you want, call in advance, let the people know. So when you get there, you don't even have to come in. The car can just be waiting for you outside to go on that test drive or to do a walk around or what have you. So to the extent you can minimize your time indoors as an interior decorator, you're going to want to do that. I mean, I think it's commonly accepted at this point that the virus spread much less effectively outdoors than it does indoors. So when you walk into someone's house, I mean, maybe that person's fine, but maybe their kid or somebody else has it and is asymptomatic and you don't know. So, I mean, you're going to want to just minimize. The key is just minimizing contact. So you want to get in and get out as it relates to the inside of the house, and wash your hands and keep that face mask on, I guess. And I would require them to be. If I was going into someone's house to spend any significant time to work with them, I would, respectfully ask them to make sure they're wearing a face mask as well as myself.
Thank you for that. One question is, can we require customers to wear face masks to enter the business?
Yeah, and so this is Mark. It's a pretty purely legal question. I mean, you can, and you're seeing businesses do that. I went to a grocery store chain here the other day, and there's a sign pretty prominently displayed that said they're requiring customers to wear masks. Now, if you go that route, of course, you're going to have to think about what your response is going to be if someone refuses to do that. And it's a very, very tricky situation. We've seen, of course, the worst happen, confrontations between employees and customers that have resulted in very negative outcomes. And so, if you're going to ask your employees to do that, to basically effectively kick someone out, you're really going to want to make sure they're properly trained on, first of all the things that you should do before you do that, offering them face masks, offering them other avenues to shop, and then, de-escalation techniques and things of that nature. But just as a simple answer to the question, yes, an employer, or excuse me, a business can require people wear face masks before they enter or when they're in the business.
Marshall, this is one that might pertain to your research and what you put together. What are some advice and best practices for bringing small groups of 3 to 10 people together for in-person meetings? I know you've looked at our plans at the Better Business Bureau. What is your advice for people and companies that might have small 3 to 10 person meetings? And Marshall, I'll note you are muted still.
There we go. According to the latest executive order, groups of 10 or less are allowed as long as you are able to maintain social distancing. So If you are in a space that's large enough, you can legally, be together. You've got to take into account all of the variables, and really the ultimate goal is to protect your personnel, to protect your employees. So based upon what I've researched and the virus, the longer you're in an enclosed area with people, especially if it's not a well-ventilated area, the more chance you have of getting a viral load and getting sick if one person happens to be sick in that room. So you've got to consider the length of this meeting too. If you're in there for a short 10-minute meeting and you're able to maintain 6 feet, I wouldn't be that concerned. But if it's going to be an hour meeting and you're sitting across from a table from people, you might want to consider there being some kind of a barrier up along that conference table so people aren't able to share their germs. And there are so many ways to conduct virtual meetings nowadays. I would highly recommend that and they're free. Set up a Zoom meeting, set up a Google Hangouts meeting. You can share your screen. You can get on the telephone if your connection's bad with your computer. Whatever you have to do, there are several ways that you can do it virtually, and that's probably the best route to go.
Thank you, Marshall. And this is one that I think either of you might be able to answer. If an employee's temp is high and the employer sends that employee home, what advice do you have? What are the prudent, sensitive ways to follow up with them for their COVID-19 testing information? So if you do send an employee home because their temperature is too high, what should those steps be for employers following that?
Well, in my experience, it varies. Mark, you could probably speak to this more in the various areas that you deal with, because it's my understanding that this can vary locally in terms of the legal aspect.
Yeah, it can. You're going to want to check these local orders that I talked about earlier in the presentation. You're going to want to make sure that you're following those obligations. But to the extent you have someone that is symptomatic of that has one of these designated symptoms, and the common one now is going to be temperature. So you have an employee that tests over 100.4, which is kind of your generally accepted line in the sand. But they don't have COVID necessarily, or there's no reason to think they have it, but they've indicated or they have tested high with the temperature. Generally, what you need to do is you need to have them go home. And again, this goes back to the rollout of the plan and the communication, is that none of this should be a surprise to your employees. In the plan, you need to pretty much lay out what happens to the extent someone is not allowed in because they've exhibited a symptom. But they're going to want to be sent home, and generally what happens is they need to remain home they need to be asymptomatic or whatever the symptom was. So if they have this fever, they need to be home for at least 3 days with no fever. So if you send them home on a Monday because they've got a 101 fever, Tuesday they self-check at home and they're still 101. Wednesday, maybe they're 100.9, and then Thursday they drop down and they're back down to 98.6. Well, then they need to be 3 days from that point without being feverish to come back. So that's kind of the generally accepted plan. But again, it needs to be communicated in advance to your employees about what is going to happen, because that's a natural question. All of a sudden every day, potentially you're taking their temperature and asking some health screening questions, and they're going to want to know what happens if they answer affirmatively to any of those, and that's what should probably happen.
Yeah, and I would just add one more thing to the fever scenario. If they developed any new symptoms, even if the fever has gone down, if they've developed new symptoms like coughs or difficulty breathing, that may extend that period. It just depends on that individual circumstance. In our particular policy, we have a return to work if a person has not been tested with the 72 hours for the fever, coughs and other symptoms have improved, and 7 days have passed since they first experienced the symptom. So that's what we have in our policy.
So to follow up on that, is a COVID-19 test required to return back to work? And if it's not required as part of general requirements, is it something you can require as an employer?
It's not required by law. Is it something you can require? I'm going to have to say, attorneys hate to say this, by the way, but I don't know. I don't. My instinct is to say it's not something you can require, but I just don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't either.
All right, but it isn't something that is required for them to do in order to bring that employee back then.
No, I mean, if you're feverish and then your fever breaks and all that, you can come back. You don't need there's no requirement that person test negative for COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. Thank you, everybody. There were some specific questions that came to us regarding construction. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach out to those people specifically. We did a webinar about a week ago with a group that deals specifically with the construction industry. So I'd like to get you in touch with them, and they can answer those questions, I think, a little more specifically than Marshall and Mark can. But I want to get you the help. So I will reach out to you individually to get those answers to your questions. As we wrap up here, I'd like to hand it off to Phil to close out with some final thoughts.
Thank you, Marshall and Mark, for a really informative presentation. We're going to have this recorded and available to all who want to go through this material, whether they didn't see it yet or they'd like to review it again. And just want to let you know that the Better Business Bureau is going to be continually seeking out the best speakers on information that's really relevant right now. And I know that the national legislative bodies are in the process of approving some loosened rules on the payroll protection plan forgiveness. We're going to seek out information on that. That'll probably get approved this week or early next week as well. And now a lot of social justice issues are really rising to the top, where I think there's going to be an expectation where businesses can't dodge and weave on this anymore. We're going to have to be a little bit more out front in taking a stance on some of these issues on social justice, and we're going to have to think about how to wisely do those things, because customers are going to expect it, our employees are going to expect it. So be looking for those from your Better Business Bureau, and thank you so much for all attending. Have a great day.